everyone. Welcome to today's web talk about the current Sino-American conflict and Europe's role in that context. My name is Sonia Ament. I'm a program manager at the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for our office in Stuttgart and would very much like to welcome you on behalf of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation and on behalf of our cooperation partner, the German-American Center in Stuttgart, for co-organizing this event. Thank you. Before I introduce today's speakers on this topic, let me say a few words about the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, as some of you might participate in one of our events for the first time. Based on the principles of liberalism, the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom offers political education in Germany and abroad. Therefore, our headquarters is based close to Berlin and Potsdam, and we maintain offices throughout Germany and in over 60 countries around the world. So with our events and publications, we try to help people to become actively involved in political matters. And on top of that, we also do support talented young students with scholarships. And now it is a great honor for me to welcome our speakers for today. Scott Kennedy, he is Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategy and International Studies. Before, he was a professor at Indiana University from 2000 to 2014, where he established the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business and was the founding academic director of Indiana University's China office. Next, Didi Kirsten Tadloff. Didi is Senior Fellow at the Asia Program at the German Council of Foreign Relations in Berlin and a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at Project Synopsis in Prague. In 2019, she began a series called China in Germany, examining the influence and interference activities of the Communist Party of China in Germany, and also co-authored the book China's Quest for Foreign Technology Beyond Espionage. And for Andreas Lehrfeld, he is the program officer at the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom and will be interviewing our two guests today. So before we start, let me also explain one single Zoom setting to you. You are all very welcome to ask your questions during this web talk, and you can therefore use the button on the lower end of your screen. It's called Q&A to post questions, and we will try to tie in as many as possible. So now, I hope you'll all enjoy this web talk. Andreas, let's start.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you very much. Thank you, Scott Kennedy and Didi Kirsten Tadloff, for being here, for having you as our guests tonight or today, because Washington time is at, we have noon, great. Right. So as a sinologist myself, I have dedicated myself to China for a couple of years now, and I'm happy to discuss a very important topic for not only the transatlantic partnership, but also for Europe itself, for its positioning with the US and with the world. The Sino-American conflict is a central feature shaping international order in the 21st century, and it entails economic and political repercussions for all sides. We have witnessed 4 years of Donald Trump as US president, and the transatlantic partnership has come under strain in the course of these 4 years. We're witnessing a new US administration under Joe Biden for a couple of months now, and a new approach towards its traditional allies and China is crystallizing rather slowly. So against this backdrop of these developments, a rising China and a powerful US, a couple of questions arise. Which role can Europe play in the context of the grand Sino-American conflict? Is the EU too dependent on China in its trade policy and its business approach? And can a new approach under Biden be identified? So I would give both speakers for tonight like 2 minutes roughly to make a short opening statement with the points they both deem necessary or important for today's topic. And then I would just I would start the discussion on the status quo. Where are we right now? And then afterwards discuss some areas of cooperation and conflict in this power triangle between the US, China, and Europe or the European Union respectively. And afterwards, we want to try to look forward to developments and things that should be addressed in the future. So, Scott Kennedy, I would give you the floor first. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Sonia and Andreas, for having me speak to this audience. US-EU collaboration is more important than ever, and I'm really happy to do it with your foundation and where you are. Actually, my grandfather on my mom's side is from Stuttgart, so it's really nice to hear to be connected back to my roots. I should say I'm in Washington, D.C. As you can tell, I'm not in my basement anymore. I'm back in my office, but I'm not in China. And I don't know when I'm going to get back to China. And I don't know if this event is going to make it harder or easier for me to get back to China. And honestly, I don't care. But I really do think it's important to have this conversation because U.S. cooperation with the EU and other market democracies around the world is going to be critical for managing our relationship with China for many years. Let me make a few specific points and then look forward to having the conversation the rest of the time and engaging with Didi and everyone else. The first point is the US and EU need to come to agreement on what the challenge with China is. We're actually still having that debate in the United States. And there is no, even though it looks like there's a consensus because Biden hasn't eliminated all of Trump's policies, there's actually still plenty of things to disagree about. My own view is that China represents an alternative model, authoritarian state capitalism that is a challenge to market democracies, not just the US, and to the institutions that undergird them and the international system. That said, even though China has been relatively successful and has advanced in high tech, in the great majority of technologies, China still trails the West. And our challenge is to maintain those advantages, not catch up with China. It's still behind. And I think we need to recognize that. It's very, very important. Second, we often hear from countries and the world, don't make us choose between the US and China. Well, the right answer to that is you already chose. You chose a long time ago, Europe did, when it collaborated with the US and the West in forming the GATT and then the WTO, and then by joining NATO together and by sharing democracies. So, and usually it's actually not the US that tells sides to choose, it's the Chinese. So if you're going to pick, I don't think there's really, you don't have to pick a country, you have to pick a system. And you've already chosen that system. Third, the big challenge for us going forward to manage the competition with China encompasses a few elements. We already know that it's about strengthening ourselves at home, economically and socially and politically, and building a common defense against dangerous Chinese activities. The most, and those will both be extremely difficult. The biggest challenge is to use our interdependence with China to our advantage. There's been a lot of talk about decoupling, and I think actually decoupling benefits China more than us, but we need to strategically use our relationship and the leverage that we have with it to try and build defenses with China and also try and push China in a constructive direction. Finally, although we've achieved some initial momentum in the US-EU relationship in finding a common approach on China, over the next 12 to 18 months, we need to get some more specific results. This might be in areas of human rights or in technology and data or in infrastructure. Wherever it is, it's more important to have some successes than specifically where they are. And maybe some of our conversation can be about where the most likely places we can get some wins in the near future. So I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much for this input. I will give over to Didi Kirsten Tadlow for her
Yeah,
remarks.
thanks very much, everyone. Very, very nice to be here to see you, Scott, Andreas, to meet you virtually, and everyone else, Sonia. I also have a little grandfather story, actually, because my German grandfather was a great fan of the FDP, if I may say so. He was a fan of the Freiheit von und zu Stein. So I grew up with stories about this political liberalism in Germany, which was always presented to me as a very fine tradition. And it's a very unique tradition, I think, in some ways in Germany too. So I'm glad to be here tonight, because I do notice that it's the, you guys who really talk about issues of personal individual freedom the most, it seems to me, in the German political domestic discourse. And I think that's something that might, I'm not making a party political statement here, but it's a kind of a idealism, if you like, which maybe, one sense is particularly connected to China, is missing quite badly in the German debate about China, where it's very dominated by economy, very dominated by the very specific interests of very big companies, such as VW, such as BASF, such as Siemens, and how they're kind of pulling a lot of Germany in that direction too. So those voices are incredibly welcome. So I think I sort of see what the moment we're in, kind of the moment in time that we're in now in 2021, just before the German election, as sort of being at the beginning of a whole new kind of world situation. One could perhaps look at 1978, when China began to open up economically after the death of Mao, until 2018, as a kind of I'd sum it up with Bill Clinton's words, it's the economy, stupid. And that was sort of the era where the so-called West, the so-called democratic countries, which we are in fact, believed that the economy would change things in China. And this is exemplified nowhere more than really at this point than Angela Merkel's policy of Handel durch Wandel, change through trade. Now, to me, since about 2018, 40 years, that's completely run out, really, when you look at facts on the ground in China. But in Europe, here in Europe, we are lagging, I think, in awareness that that shift has actually happened. And our own cognition of the problem is quite different, I think, right now than exists in the US. And I think it does lead to a lot of what I would call cognitive dissonance here in Europe. If we look at, for example, the situation in the US, Scott, you could have something to say here, but it seems to me that there's maybe a kind of a, 60-40, 70-30 percentage recognition that China's political system is threatening, actually, to open societies and to democracies in very profound ways, particularly through data. Whereas in the UK, we're probably looking at something like, for example, 30% awareness, 70% non-awareness. And in Germany, I would say we're worse off in the UK, probably around 2080, something like this. Others could disagree with those figures. I'm just throwing them out there as an idea. So, there's a real lag here in Germany, I think, in terms of political and top economic and strategic thinking about the nature of this challenge. A lot of that is historical in nature. Germany for a long time was dependent, if you like. It was almost subaltern, if one were to put it rather unkindly, on the United States. This is the Cold War order, the system of Germany, and it was free to do its Ostpolitik thing, to approach Russia, to approach East Germany, and ultimately, as we're seeing now, to sort of approach China in ways that are deeply uncritical about the political situation there. And I think that this sort of dream of Ostpolitik very much is still driving things forward in Germany. So, I'll leave it there. There's lots to talk about. I don't want to talk too long. Perhaps just a pointer ahead to Merkel's trip on Friday, her farewell trip to America, which, Andreas, I'm sure you'll be raising anyway, and what might come out of that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for this insight. Yes, before turning our eye on China-related issues and areas of conflict, I would start at the bottom at the status quo, or the status of transatlantic relations. So I would ask you, how do you assess the current state of transatlantic relations, and how was Donald Trump's presidency? How has it affected these relations? And do you see a new approach under Joe Biden?
Is that for me?
Yeah, I would take this question to Washington. Yeah. Sure.
Okay. Well, I think one of the big challenges with President Trump's policies is that he treated most other countries the same. China and the EU, South Korea, and others that had trade surpluses with the U.S. were viewed very similarly. And he had tariffs against everybody, and he elbowed his way in front of others to get pictures wherever he went. I think what we're seeing with the Biden administration is a very different framing of what the China challenge is, and therefore a very different view of other countries. So Trump, again, viewed this basically as an arm wrestling match for interests, and didn't discriminate against countries based on their regime type or domestic politics. In fact, he's probably more hostile to democracies than to non-democracies. We see quite differently with Biden administration a strong emphasis on the importance of market democracies and China's system as a challenge to that. As a result, he's tried to provide reassurance to Europe about that the importance of our common values and actually many shared interests, and withdrawn a variety of tariffs and come to agreement to suspend the conflict between Boeing and Airbus, and has looked to try and figure out other ways in which we can achieve significant victories. There are some areas where it will be quite tough. The U.S. is still trying to figure out what to do on data privacy and information, and that's an area where the Chinese approach is very different from both of ours. But the U.S. and EU are, we don't have anything like GDPR. So, nevertheless, I think we have a strong working relationship. I think the challenge is the danger is the shadow of the future. I was talking to someone from France a few months ago, soon after Biden's inauguration, and asking about strategic autonomy, and and their view was, well, Biden won this time, but will he win in 2024, or will a regular American politician? So maybe we have the Le Pen problem, or other right-wing parties in Europe that could upset the apple cart for transatlantic cooperation. I'm not I don't have the political crystal ball to tell you where the U.S. is going to be going, but that worry about the future may create some types of restrictions on how far the U.S. and EU are willing to collaborate on specifics, and so that's a big concern.
Yeah, taking a look at you mentioned it, the Wandel durch Handel policy shaped by Germany, mainly through by the Merkel administration for the last 10 or 15 years. The belief that you can change a system through trade and enhancement of trade relationships. So, do you think that the EU is too dependent on China, or has made itself too dependent on China?
I think that the EU thinks it's too dependent on China. And this is the fundamental problem. Again, it's a question of awareness. And I think that our awareness here in Europe is pretty poor. And also, we just don't have enough good information. And there are far too many people, in my opinion, who automatically distrust anything that comes out of the United States, and therefore just dismiss it. So, there's this push now to create a so-called European knowledge base about China. And I'm really not entirely sure what that means. If it's going to be just localized information, that's fine. But the actual methods of analysis and what we're actually dealing with in China isn't different between the US and Europe. It is what it is. So I think we need to wait and see what that in fact means. But at the end of the day, Europe believes it's dependent on China, and I think a lot of this is just because it's there's a real lack of strategic thinking in Europe. I think that tradition is weak. It's certainly weak in Germany. It's been actively discouraged for a long time, of course. Last time Germany was super strategic ended really badly, World War II. So it's going to take time to cultivate that ability. And, there are people who are probably always going to be against it. So what to do? And I do worry quite a bit, because I think that the attitudes towards the US and in Europe are very unstable. I think that Scott's absolutely right about the Trump issue, going ahead, the Trump factor, so to speak. one of the first things I remember people talking about here in Germany after Biden won was, okay, but look how many votes Trump got, he's going to be back. And if it's not him, it's going to be somebody else. So what are we going to do? And you know, that's really profoundly disturbing to a lot of people here. So on the other hand, you know, the European Union is such a sort of strange creature. It's not cohesive. It's regulatory. It has no military force other than NATO, which is transatlantic, if you like. And yet, at the same time, you know, if it didn't exist, we'd have to create it, because Europe is lots of little countries that are really quite quarrelsome. You look at Brexit recently, and France and Germany. I mean, it's just endless, really. So, you know, Europe has a lot, I think, has a lot of soul searching to do on its own values, what it actually itself believes in the sense of actually wanting to actively support these democratic values and not just pay lip service to them and then hope that America will just do the heavy lifting. I still think that that's ahead of us.
Yeah. Hey, can I chime in on that question, Andreas? Because this is really gets to the fundamental crux of things, and I think, you know, there is this deep concern that we've become overly dependent on China. And I can understand that there's a need that you don't want to give China too much leverage, whether it's in the proportion of the products that you sell, the inexpensive manufacturing in China for your products so that you have efficient supply chains regardless of the final producer, or income from Chinese students who study in our universities, or tourists, or things like that. But and so we need to find places where we're particularly vulnerable. It may be in rare earths, it may be in medical equipment, APIs, active pharmacological ingredients for drugs. There may be some specific areas where we're particularly vulnerable. But let's not forget, China is more dependent on us than we are on them in almost every area. And we have more power than them as a result of this interdependence, and we need to use it. So yes, we need some rare earth raw materials from China, but they need our semiconductor manufacturing equipment. We can find rare earths in a lot of different places. They can't get their semiconductor manufacturing equipment from anywhere but us. We want China's market, right? But China needs to be able to send its students to the West to study and get degrees. So that interdependence is meant to tie both of our hands, and it's working. And we just need to, but it doesn't work automatically. You actually have to proactively utilize that and use China's dependence and its integration to our advantage. The difficulty, as Didi mentioned, is China's one voice, one system. They have no scruples. They can make choices and penalize and give gifts willingly. We have to coordinate amongst ourselves. We have a collective action problem. But if we can fix the collective action problem, and that's not an easy one, we've got hundreds of years of political science research and scholarship about the difficulty of it. But if we can, then we have huge advantages over China that we should continue to utilize. And really, that's our challenge, is to use interdependence as a strength, not as a weakness.
And I think like China is quite aware of this potential strength. So it seems that they try to pursue a divide and conquer policy to divide the European countries. Like, for example, I think of the 16+1 initiative with the states of Eastern Europe, and the signal that Lithuania dropped out of these talks may be a sign that China has overplayed its card. Or do you share this view? Like this, they're trying to influence, or to it's on all non-China issues, it's very hard to find common ground among all 27 EU states, but with special regard to China. So do you share this view?
If I could just, that Lithuania is a fascinating example now. Of course, it has very little trade with China, but it's really, really interesting country. But if I may just briefly go back to Scott's point, that was, the thing about dependency, to me, I think dependency in a way is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you start saying you're dependent, well, then you keep going and you have this path dependency, and you know what, you really are dependent. I mean, when things need to change, you need to change them. And I think, to take the example of the German car industry, in fact, only 8% of German exports go to China. It's a pretty low number. And yet there is a sense of, without China, we're lost. Now, this is CCP propaganda, because, it reminds me of the famous revolutionary song that without the Communist Party, there is no new China. It's like, without the Communist Party, we have no life, or without the Communist Party, there is no trade in the world. I mean, this is complete nonsense, of course. And it's absolutely a propaganda. It's a dominant strategy. It's a dominance narrative. This is the awareness problem that I think we have very, very strongly in Europe. So I just wanted to make that point. Having said that, of course, the German car industry, BASF, etc., are in fact getting a lot of money from China. But do you know what? We don't always know. I think we don't fully always know where that money is going, because a lot of the profits are made domestically. What is coming out? Is it being reinvested? This is work we need to do in Europe as well, is to really unpick, for example, some of these very major companies and the money they're actually making in China, because it's not necessarily benefiting Germany as a nation, or Europe as a directly as a region. That's a complicated subject. But on Lithuania, it's such an interesting country with what they're doing, and they have these traditionally strong ties to Taiwan. And they've just offered people from Hong Kong to go there without, even if they have no papers, you go along to a Lithuanian consulate or an embassy, and apparently this is a serious offer, and they will work something out for you if you are a political refugee. And this is an extraordinary position to take. Having said that, Lithuania is, it's a small country in Europe. And the other recent plea they made, the Lithuanian foreign minister, was for Europe to please stop all this Germany and France leading stuff, and to actually get together as 27 countries and actually to say, look, you need to share this stuff more. And I actually couldn't agree more, because this whole idea of Germany and France leading after the shock of Brexit, it was sort of understandable. Like, there's kind of worries about where this was going, but it's having the effect of alienating other European nations. It's a sort of a centrifugal force, I think, at this point. And that would really be, something to think about with Lithuania. And yes, they're out of the 17+1. I think China's extremely annoyed about that. Beijing quickly started saying, well, there's lots more where they came from. But skepticism is absolutely rising. And again, these countries, Lithuania, Central Eastern Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, etc., they have a real, Estonia, they have real skin in the game, if you like, because they're very worried about Russia. They're worried about Russia-China cooperation in a way that, again, Germany and France just aren't and don't. And so, again, you have to wonder what that's going to do to Europe to have these kinds of pressures. I've a little bit wandered off your question, Andreas, but Lithuania is a super interesting case here.
Yeah, I want to turn the attention to one focus area, like I would say trade and business. We should start with that, and in the context of today's topic. How do you see the foreign direct investment, the Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe? Maybe also from the American perspective, because it is quite interesting. I just wanted to drop some names, like Piraeus. The port of Piraeus is such an example, like in the greater context of the Belt and Road Initiative, or one recent example, Didi, you mentioned it. This is the port in Hamburg through Costco, the Chinese state company. So they are investing quite particularly in European infrastructure. So what's your point of view on this matter? Should it be banned? This is an extreme position, or regulated more through political bodies?
If you're asking me, Andreas, yes, absolutely. We've got a huge problem in Europe. I'm struggling to understand how this Costco deal which would enable Costco, a state-owned company, to take over operations on, of part of Hamburg port. It's not the only one in Germany right now. I'm struggling to understand how it passed the much vaunted inward investment screening mechanism. Apparently it did. I really am pretty gobsmacked by this, because, you just have to turn things around to try and build a sense of what's wrong and what's right with this interaction with China and Germany, is to turn things around and say, well, can we do that there? The answer is, of course we can't, because China has an extremely precise understanding of the significance of critical infrastructure. They wouldn't even dream of such a thing. See, so I think this inward investment business, it's not just ports. We've also got a new data center that opened this year in Frankfurt, China Mobile Data, Services Center. There's all kinds of stuff happening that simply can't happen the other way around. And I just wonder at what point Europeans start to understand that, that they aren't, that they're just as vulnerable as anyone else to great power, and that they need to sort of protect themselves better. So that would be again, this goes back to the awareness problem. I think that in Europe, our debate about China is still very unaware.
Would you like to add something
Sure.
to this? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if our relationship with China was a lot better, if the strategy to integrate China into the international order was continuing to yield some success, and I would say it did for a while before Xi Jinping, we got China to abide by a variety of international agreements, reduce its negative behavior on security issues quite a bit. But that's really changed the last 9 years since Xi Jinping's been in power. And as a result, it totally makes sense to raise our fences on investment on national security grounds. The U.S. in 2018 passed a new law updating its investment screening with a piece of legislation called FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Reform and Revitalization Act. We passed a new law that year also on export controls. And Chinese investment had already begun to slow because of China's own financial weakness and trimming the sails of going out. But then the U.S. essentially hung a not for sale sign for many of these technologies. And we went from having a small yard high fence to a medium yard high fence. It's not quite as large as China is yet. We're still more open. But a lot of things which would have sold no problem and that had sold, we're thinking about. That's why there's so on anything related to personal data now, which wouldn't have been seen as a national security concern 7 or 8 years ago, is now certainly off limits. I would say, and the reciprocity argument that Didi mentioned, I think that was more important 5 years ago, when we could say, well, geez, you got Tencent and Alibaba with cloud centers in the United States. Well, AWS and Microsoft and others should be able to have cloud centers in China. Now, even if you let AWS and Microsoft's Azure have business in China, I don't know. I wouldn't let China have cloud services here anyway. So reciprocity argument is really about a commercial fairness, whereas national security should just be about what is genuinely fair. And maybe reciprocity is an indication of how threatening a country is, but for the most part, there's sort of other metrics and certainly vital infrastructure. I think if the Chinese walked in and tried to go to a port in the United States and buy it and like they have in the past, hopefully they'd be turned away. But you never know. Sometimes somebody would not be paying attention. And certainly there are a variety of Chinese investments in the US, which if they were reviewed today would raise some significant concerns. Yeah,
I would like to address one particular issue in this context. You mentioned it, Scott. There was one of your proposals concerned 5G, and the tide against 5G, or is turning against 5G in many European capitals. But your proposal, Scott, if I understand this correctly, was to build a non-Chinese 5G network and try to reach a multilateral agreement on this issue. And this is one thing I would like to take a question from our audience and ask this in this context. We have some different understandings on data protection in the US and in Europe, quite different understandings on that. So how would you reach an agreement on this matter on 5G at the moment? I think this is, from a transatlantic perspective, it's quite difficult, I assume.
Yeah, well, I welcome Didi's comments on this as well. The Trump administration started a program called the Clean Networks Initiative by the State Department, and the Undersecretary Keith Kroc was the real leader of this, working with folks in the National Security Council and other parts of the administration. And they eventually, and the original idea was we need to have any data that's going to flow in and out of the United States to travel on networks that the U.S. national security establishment can trust, because any equipment in that network along that pathway that you can't trust is a vulnerability that we can't accept. And so they began this campaign primarily directed at trying to get Huawei equipment out of our networks, and acceptable for legacy 4G, but not for 5G, because the architecture of 5G reduces the significance between what's called the core and the edge, and there's a lot of software in the network where you can have a lot of mischief and it's very hard to monitor. And the Trump administration worked diligently. They were on a lot of planes, went to a lot of capitals, made their case. In some places they were successful, in some places they weren't. And Germany and the UK are two places where they've struggled, but made some progress, particularly in the UK. They changed their mind. And I think it wasn't necessarily due to a difference of opinion, but it was due to a difference of what type of risks they're willing to accept, or what risks they thought were significant, so significant. But I do think the further we get along this, we're seeing that I think the conversation I'm hearing in the US is that we can't depend just on Samsung, Nokia, and Ericsson as alternatives to Huawei. That you've got they're too small, and the two European vendors are actually economically suffering quite a bit, and we can't make this a process just to save these two companies' financial situations. So we're going to need something in addition. We just can't find other alternatives to Huawei equipment or ZTE, and so that's this Open RAN alternative, where you basically could use any type of equipment and have an open source, clean system where you don't need Huawei equipment. And so that's really where most of the investment and energy is still going in the Biden administration. And we also see it in Congress, in the legislation that's passed the Senate and is being taken up by the House of Representatives now. So now there is a debate, a worthwhile debate having. First of all, is Huawei equipment really that dangerous? Secondly, is it about hardware? Is that really the biggest source of vulnerability? Or should we assume, from a national security perspective, that every network is vulnerable regardless of the specific hardware that's in it, because people can hack everywhere? But I think in the United States, we're leaning toward the sort of firmest of solutions, which is really most trusted equipment by trusted suppliers, and coming up with a multilateral system where we all agree, those who are part of it, to those common principles. And I think that's the kind of thing I see within the Biden administration that they're pushing right now.
Is there something you would like to add?
Yeah, I think 5G has had a rocky sort of short so far history in Germany, some of you will know, and it's been a huge cause, I think, of transatlantic concern, because particularly after some of these latest hacks in the US, it's clear that, you know, the government there is not going to accept untrusted networks to be truly developed, or to share information with countries and systems that are using networks that they just can't trust. And that's going to be highly relevant, I guess, for many countries in the world, including Germany, where there's been a super reluctance to move against Huawei. I mean, if you look at the big telecoms providers, Deutsche Telekom, for example, but not just, you know, real pushback. And there's a sense even that things happen so slowly in Germany. You've got an election in September. It's going to take months to work stuff out. I mean, the whole decision on networks appears to have moved a little bit in a more kind of secure direction, perhaps, i.e., in, you know, away from Huawei, because we all know what stands behind Huawei. I mean, I think it's pretty clear. And yet there's a sense that facts are being achieved on the ground as we speak, because these decisions are happening so slowly in Germany. And you know, time then becomes a factor in an actual thing per se, in trying to create, you know, build up more protective systems for these open societies which live in, which are so vulnerable. Actually, they're highly vulnerable because of their very openness. So, you know, not a massive amount of cooperation as far as we can see in Germany in particular. Sweden's a different story. The Swedes have had real challenges to their government's decision not to use Chinese telecoms providers. And they are basically seeing them off one after the other, saying this is national security. I'm sorry, commercial things don't trump national security. But it's just not an attitude that we have, or that we see here in Germany. And again, I think this relates to far deeper issues in Germany. For example, you know, the whole concept of national security being sort of a bad word here. And then the services as well, the analysis services. You know, there's no obligation on the part of the government to even listen to what they say. You can have security services making some piece, you know, giving a piece of advice to the government in Germany, and the government will just completely ignore it because they really don't have that tradition, and there's a suspicion there. So it's just a super different situation. And that's a little bit also what worries me with transatlantic relations now, because you know, for so long now, we haven't really seen, I don't know, we haven't really seen any particular idealism, or, and I'm not saying idealism is necessarily a good thing, but or any sort of vision. I think in German politics, it's been highly pragmatic. Recently, I came across a very interesting quote by Angela Merkel, which she told to Henry Kissinger when she won the Kissinger Prize in Berlin in 2020. And she actually quoted Lenin and said that she'd learned from Lenin that life or politics was a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And then she added, best case scenario. And I thought, well, you know, that's sort of an interesting thing to say. I'm not saying Lenin was wrong. I was just curious that she said Lenin had this influence on her. You know, he was obviously an unusual thinker. But it's worth actually reading that speech that she gave, of what it revealed about her and her instincts, you know. And again, so 5G stuff like that, I think we're just caught in a bit of a slow lane here in Germany right now, and I, you know, I hope that things sort out, and that people get more on the same page, including just with our neighbor Sweden, by the way.
Do you think this issue could become important for the next German administration?
Absolutely.
5G debate.
Right, of course, exactly. They're going to have to deal with it. I mean, they've now got their sort of agreement, which looks like it's going to be a kind of a, well, no, we need to trust our providers, but it hasn't been a very public debate in many ways. I think that the truth of what's going to happen has not entirely been revealed to the public, because, you know, I think German businesses are terrified of being, you know, attacked by China. And it doesn't take much, you know. For example, 5G, exactly Huawei last year, the Chinese ambassador to Germany came out with a statement as of, well, gosh, wouldn't it be awful if something happened to your car industry? You know, if our telecoms technology could not compete fairly in the world. And everyone kind of went, oh, no. I mean, that's really all it took. And everyone just was terribly frightened. And I think it's this sort of risk aversion in Germany. It's a very risk averse society, which, again, I keep coming back to, this has its historical reasons, but you wonder going forward how that's going to where that's going to leave the country.
Thank you. I would address one issue with regard to the EU-China relations or economic investment relations. One issue that was in the news a couple of weeks or months ago was the comprehensive agreement on investment, CAI, which was ultimately blocked by the European Parliament, or ratification was blocked. Do you see any chance that this agreement will be ratified in the future? Because it took 9 years of negotiations, and Scott, you mentioned reciprocity, and this is an issue that was important a couple of years ago, but the EU actively tried to address this issue of reciprocity, of market access. So now, in its current state, it is blocked. But do you see any chance that this agreement is going to be ratified?
Well, not anytime soon. I think it's really unlikely that we're going to see the CAI ratified and implemented soon. And in some ways, it's a shame. Because if you go through the text, you will see that China's moved significantly on a variety of different commercial issues, including market access. And in fact, in some ways, it borrows from the bilateral investment agreement that the US and China were negotiating at the end of the Obama administration, which they never got across the line. And so, and just like that agreement, this one potentially has benefits for others if there's use of most favored nation status, where others can also claim the same kinds of rights. There's also rules related to state-owned enterprises and things like that. That said, there were big howlers in this. The obvious things that that others looking from outside the point of view of the two groups negotiating saw as kind of unacceptable, and the rules on labor didn't make any sense. I mean, China, the EU claimed that the Chinese commitments to improve labor standards and consult with the International Labor Organization's rules was basically a commitment to do nothing. And there was really no significant change whatsoever, and that a lot more should have been demanded. I think that's probably what initially created some pushback within folks within the EU. And then you've got the Xinjiang stuff that went totally the wrong direction, and China basically just sunk itself. And it sunk itself further on Hong Kong. And wolf warrior diplomacy and lecturing and finger pointing. And I don't see how you can't point a finger like you can unring a bell. So it's going to be really, really difficult for this to be salvaged. Now, it could be that Xi Jinping was really just looking for, that his happy day was the day it was signed, and on December 30th or 31st, and he had Merkel and Macron on like a live Zoom, and that's all he wanted, so that he could, show the U.S. that in this competition for the middle, China was winning. But longer term, everything since then, it's been, China's come out on the losing end. Every week there's something where things look worse and worse for them.
What is your assessment today? If you could share your view on, do you see it's feasible?
I mean, Kai, I just, a day or two after CAI was agreed on, so I think it was on January 1 or January 2nd, China also passed an updated national defense law. And in that defense law, what they added was a couple of things. And one of them was that from that moment on, the development interests would be the cause for the use of military force. So violating China's or blocking China's development interests would be a cause for the use of force by the Chinese military. Now, to me, this was a really interesting moment because development interests, what does that mean? It means economic and social development is usually the phrase. So let's just be generous and say economic development just, for example. And, you know, I just think it was a red flag because I do agree about some of the advantages, and, you know, China's not going away. It's never going away. But I think that as, you know, with Europe preparing to get closer and yet being so fundamentally so quite vulnerable in many ways because of this lack of the ability to think in strategic or security terms, I think, which is quite, you know, that's a real problem, I think, in Europe. I just really was concerned that Europe was sort of, you know, getting on board with this notion of ever deepening integration without really having the ability to push back in the ways that would be necessary, this sort of robust pushback. And I think that seeing ever deepening integration against the background of China suddenly saying that development interests are a casus belli, basically, a cause for the use of military force. This was I found this really quite worrying context to CAI. I mean, it came just after, but it was obviously planned for well. And I'm not saying that it was necessarily a direct or immediate threat of any kind, but I think it did show the environment into which Europe is getting more and more deeply involved, or would have, you know, also with CAI. And I felt that the timing was poor. You know, Biden had just come in. It was really time to repair transatlantic relations, not to move even closer toward China. So, you know, and China's been very clear that they saw this as a triumph against the US. And just the other day, again, Xi Jinping had another meeting with Merkel and Macron. And there was a lot of talk at that meeting, and another meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Joseph Borrell, the EU Foreign Minister. There's a lot of talk about how Europe should have a correct understanding of relations with China and so on and so forth. So I think we're really seeing a lot of propaganda, diplomatic, public pressure to sort of create an atmosphere whereby Europe's strategic autonomy means independence from the United States. I mean, this is clearly wedge behavior, trying to drive a wedge by China into the transatlantic alliance. And again, I just think that Europe is relatively vulnerable here. And, you know, I'm not saying everything's rosy on the other side. It's not. But, you know, the very fact that look, I know it's hard to negotiate any kind of a treaty with China or with anyone, but the fact that it took 9 years to negotiate CAI, and then it came at this moment in history when, in fact, frankly, it was probably the wrong time, just also tells us a little bit perhaps about slowness here in Germany and in Europe, something like that. It was like an artifact of a different era, you know, this idea that you start something in 2013 and then it would be okay by 2021 or 2020. I think that was, you know, things have changed somewhat. Yeah.
Hey, can I pick up on this a little bit? Because I want to be a little forward looking as well about something that's coming up in the next few months. And it encapsulates a lot of the discussion that we've had over the last 50 minutes, which is about Boeing and Airbus and China's own effort to build their own commercial aircraft, the C919, which is being built by a company called COMAC, the Commercial Aircraft Company of China, which is a daughter of AVIC, which is a military company which is under the Chinese Air Force. So China clearly has an import substitution goal. They'd love to have their own plane and not have to import Boeing and Airbus planes, the A320 and the 737 MAX in particular, as well as wide bodies. So it's important to note that everything in China's alternative, the C919, that keeps it in the air is from the US and the EU. Every single part. There's not it's a Chinese plane in name only. It's really an American European plane. So the question is, China is just about to is coming close, maybe within a year, of certifying the C919. China has not been received a delivery of a Boeing airplane in 3 years. It's a slow walking reception of Airbus planes. So what's the EU and the US going to do? They agreed a few weeks ago to shelve their own dispute about subsidies to focus on China. So if we can support Chinese import substitution and crush our own aerospace industries and keep exporting components for the C919, even if China doesn't buy our aircraft, we could do that, but that'd be really dumb. So can the US and the EU agree with each other that they will not sell COMAC components for the C919 unless they take delivery of both Boeing and Airbus planes? Now, following what you said, divide and conquer, Andreas, China's goal would say, oh, we'll keep taking Airbus and Boeing can go fly a kite. Well, do EU leaders have the political will to tell Airbus no, and other commercial aerospace makers in Europe, no, don't sell to China unless we get a package deal? That's an excellent example of all of the challenges that we face. So so can we do that? That's really what we have to do in the next few months to get the US and the EU on the same page in aerospace. Otherwise, we're basically complicit in supporting the rise of a third global aerospace carrier that will then be selling their planes all along the Belt and Road. And we'll go from 50-50 to 1/3, and then less. So why should we just blindly let that happen?
Yeah, may I get in, just answer directly, Andreas? Yep. One could argue, of course, China should have an aviation industry, a big country, a lot of people, etc. You could say from a point of view of economic, global, social justice, whatever, there's nothing wrong with that, then there isn't. But this does lead us on to the issue which Scott has already pointed to here, which is technology transfer and the extent to which we are clearly supplying China with massive amounts of technology, which are then deployed in an entirely different political environment from the one in which this technology was produced. And, I think that there are almost philosophical questions here about when is technology safe and within which political parameters is it safe to have technology? For example, if we're going to build, new AI-enabled bionic soldiers to fight wars, well maybe we need oversight over, at least the hope of oversight over the processes that go into creating these creatures, and not a completely opaque system. And there's lots to criticize on many aspects of this, I know that, but it's at the end of the day technology, that this whole issue of it's not values neutral, is it? It takes place within a certain political framework and context and meaning. So, but I just wonder how we're going to get to the point where we can cooperate in the way that Scott described. Although I think it's a super great point, and it would be wonderful in terms of lots of things, but because the way that competition is baked into our own systems, our own economies, our own thinking, the capitalist systems that we have in these particular iterations that they are in now, it's highly competitive. And on what basis do you then say, well, okay, let's just drop all that competition stuff and let's actually collaborate? That will take serious political muscle and serious sort of rethinking of some economic systemic issues in the West as well. And I find that sort of a quite a thought. I come out of the media area. I was a journalist for a very long time, and even when China was kind of pulling away our visas, and I was in Beijing for a long time, was denying visas or threatening to cut visas and to kick us out of the country. It was sort of really remarkable how Western media were completely unable to collaborate or cooperate with each other. Even in that sort of situation, because it was all about competing against the other guy. So I this is a different point of view, but I just think that the political vision and heft that it will take to pull that off will be it'll be quite significant. And I hope that people can think their way out of this kind of situation that we're in, and start to collaborate and cooperate more, including across the Atlantic, and especially on technology. Because just to finish my point, if the US is becoming a bit more careful about how all the technology is flowing out of America toward China, being extracted by all means possible, by all means available, as the formal phrase goes in China, by people, by universities, by conferences and PhDs, I mean, just in businesses and everything. The same is not true here in Europe. Europe remains wide open for technology outflow. And this is another area where we need to really get our act together.
Thank you. I would like, taking a look at the clock, I would like to turn the discussion to a point, to another point. One term I haven't used yet, or we haven't used that often, was values and norms. I would like, because like in the public discourse, especially in Germany or in Europe, things like Xinjiang, the human rights abuses happening in Xinjiang province in Western China, or the status of Hong Kong, the loss of autonomy. These are issues, concrete, particular issues that need to be addressed, and they are addressed. And my question goes to the way in which the US and Europe should respond. I ask because last year, when the national security law was passed in Hong Kong, it was like a communique. It was a low-key approach mainly by European states, the US as well. So how could we address these issues, particularly in regard to Xinjiang and Hong Kong? Because I don't want to say that we are entering a systemic conflict between liberal democracies and authoritarian state capitalism, as you label it, Scott. So how can we, now against the backdrop of the new administration in the US and the upcoming German government that is shaped differently than the current government, how can we react?
Sure. Super difficult, not easy at all. If you remember the sort of traditional view of the engagement strategy and human rights was that by increasing connectivity, by having foreign companies in China that live their values in terms of how they hire employees, treat employees, how they manufacture, the quality of the goods, the openness they are to fixing problems, their values, that will be a model for Chinese companies and influence things positively at the margin. The Chinese students that go to the US and the West to study will see living democracies, and those values will influence them when they go back home. They'll be ambassadors for those values. That worked okay, but not great. And the assumption was that China's integration would go faster on economics, slower on politics, but that we had Chinese leaders who believed that authoritarianism needed to be tamed and that China needed to adapt, if not having electoral democracy, but having a sort of softer authoritarian system. I mean, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang, two Chinese leaders who were purged, probably may have been interested in actual political change, but certainly that wasn't the expectation. But limiting the system, having a softer authoritarianism, depended on having reformist leaders who were fighting with a system that was pushing back. We're now obviously in a situation where that's not the case, where the top leadership in China is more authoritarian than the rest of the country. you can't see them as allies, even secret, quiet allies, in the effort to improve the protection of civil rights in China, or even private activities. And you know, I hate to say that I never like the comparison, say, you know, China's going back to the Cultural Revolution, but boy, they've turned back the clock. I don't know where the clock has stopped, but it stopped someplace before 1985. And it's really very, very difficult. And although we talk about Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and you know, it's clear that Xi Jinping ruled China is inconsistent with one country, two systems. It's now one country, one system. They're applying the lessons learned in Xinjiang and Hong Kong to the rest of the country. So it's really no better elsewhere. I mean, you don't have the ethnic differences and discrimination against minorities that you have elsewhere. But you know, even your average Han Chinese living in a city, their own car, their own apartment, the restrictions that they face now are far greater than they faced several years ago, and lots of folks are extremely unhappy. So we can't use that old strategy of just hoping gradually that will change. So that means in some situations we're going to have to, instead of talking to them privately and hoping for change, to be much more upfront and saying, you know, and drawing some significant lines. And again, I don't believe in decoupling from China altogether. I think we should use our interdependence where possible, but I'm fine decoupling from Xinjiang. I'm fine decoupling from Hong Kong, because there's nothing that we can do to make things better by importing silicon and solar panels from Xinjiang. I don't think we help them at all. And in Hong Kong, I really think, you know, the deal that we made was, we'll continue to treat Hong Kong as a special, distinctive part of China, as long as it is a special, distinctive part of China that has its own social system. But now it's like everywhere else. So it's not a matter of penalizing Hong Kong. It's just saying, we're going to treat you like Guangzhou, Wuhan, Shijiazhuang, and Tianjin. You're just no different than any of those other cities. So be it. It's and this is just how we have to do it. So not the penalizing way. It's just China broke their agreement. We're just enforcing the agreement as it was originally agreed to. And I think being consistent like that is the way you get China to change. They read the polls. They see where global public opinion is going. They're seeing more and more of their officials being put on sanctions lists, more companies and organizations on entity lists. Do you think China wants to be put in the same category as North Korea and Cuba and Hungary and Saudi Arabia? No, they want to be seen as a special, and right, but this is the globe is responding. This is how they'll get the message. I don't know how they'll course correct and respond in a constructive way. Certainly what Xi Jinping said a couple weeks ago, that we need to have a more positive image, was nothing but superficial PR. But at some point they'll get the message that there needs to be a major course correction. And certainly, if we go back to the last time there was this big change in the 70s, it was China facing a united international front and realizing that if they didn't change, their country was going to go the way of the dodo bird. And so I think that, it's tough love. It's tough love.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think in the beginning, I quoted Bill Clinton's "It's the economy, stupid," 1978 to 2018, that whole phase of, China engagement from the US, from Europe. I think that post 2018, we should rephrase that and call it "It's the values, stupid," but hopefully this time it'll turn out better. Backbone, we need more backbone, frankly, because, it's not about being aggressive. It's about making clear that there are red lines, and that's a sort of that's a self-protective posture, but it's also a very confident posture that I think that Beijing would completely recognize, and I think would respect it. And you know what, if it doesn't respect it, well, then we're just kind of seeing the whole problem being laid out of China trying to kind of set the terms of the debate internationally, of it spreading propaganda aggressively, of it intimidating people overseas, including all kinds of people, frankly, Hong Kongers, Uyghurs. We're now seeing, the really disturbing thing about, I think, with that we've seen, and it's a great shame that Hong Kong has sort of dropped off the discussion quite a bit, is because we're really seeing with Hong Kong what happens when that CCP system, gets hold of an open society. And what the result is, frankly, is it's just a car crash. It's awful. There are people, Hong Kong newspapers, until they shut Apple Daily recently, of course, full of articles about when to go, what to do, how to get out. I mean, this is a real exodus that's building, and it's I think if anyone, I think Hong Kong is really the best example for people in Europe, for example, of why this system in China, which is becoming increasingly internationalized, is profoundly challenging to open societies. And we see it exactly in Hong Kong, what the problem is. Values, it's become unfashionable, because of this whole focus on the economy. But turns out that at the end of the day, that not everything's about the economy, right? There are people who don't want to just live as slaves or live with threat all the time. And even in China, one thing that I remember hearing a lot from people was that the problem is that you can, when no one is safe, when there's no sense of security, then anyone, even the richest man in the country, is vulnerable. And people would say that, you could be the big tiger in the forest, but there's going to be a hunter out there with a gun somewhere. So you're not safe either. So yeah, values. It's. I'll be honest. It's a mystery to me why the European Union is so very careful when it's got so much to offer and to be serious about offering when it comes to things like reactions to Hong Kong or Xinjiang. I know that there are internal problems in Europe, but it's not exactly moving against those either, is it? So, and I'm referring here to the situation in Hungary. So,
yeah, of course, there are still human rights problems within the EU itself, as is often seen in the news. But apart from mere discussions about values, there are some. I think there's a momentum for countering like the Chinese policy. I refer to the G7 summit last June, when Joe Biden proposed the so-called Build Back Better for the World initiative, like this called an initiative countering the Belt and Road Initiative the Chinese went. And I remember that the media were quite critical about this this proposal. So how do you see this? Is this a real project that will be pursued in the next years to come, or is it just a nice example for a G7 summit statement?
I think it's not going to be the scale of the Belt and Road. And actually, I think we ought to, like other things, Chinese advertising is often larger, bigger than the reality. So, because the Belt and Road is more a bumper sticker than a cohesive, clear plan. All right, it originally just encapsulated Chinese investment directed toward across Asia by land or sea to Europe, and basically said all of that stuff is Belt and Road, and we want to encourage it and invest in rail and ports and other transportation. CSIS has a terrific website called Reconnecting Asia, where you can go see all of these projects from the Belt and Road and other international infrastructure initiatives. You can choose them and you can see where they are in terms of cost, how much has been built, and we've done a lot of analysis of them, including on the human rights side of the ledger as well. And I would say, originally, I mean, the U.S. It's we don't have large industrial policy domestically or internationally, and our foreign aid in the past has been primarily focused on helping those in most need, and has not focused on infrastructure, and that's probably partly why the Chinese thought of their plan in the first place. But we've been doing some rethink, and a lot prompted by the Japanese, who've come up with this Blue Dot Network initiative. And so really what we're, it's funny, TPP, not originally a Japanese project, but they pushed it, Free and Open Pacific, a Japanese idea, this global infrastructure initiative. Japan is having a huge effect on Western foreign policy like it's never had before in a variety of ways. And this is, I think, basically the Biden administration that says, let's take the Blue Dot Network and scale it up. We'll rename it, and we'll integrate it with our own political language and offer an alternative. Now, really, it will require the mobilization of a lot of private capital in order to make it reach significant scale. But it could, and I think it just gets to it's just trying to break the psychology that Didi's focused on for much of our conversation, is this expectation that we have to be dependent on China for X, Y, or Z. And as long as there's alternatives, diversity of sources, diversity of options, that's really what we want. That will actually maybe create some additional discipline on those Chinese projects that continue forward as well. If you look at the analysis of Belt and Road projects, where do they run into the biggest problems? Where are they successful? It usually turns on the host recipient country. How open are their politics? How strong is their civil society? How strong is their media? What type of accountability mechanisms do they have domestically? That lets them push back, and you end up getting better projects. And so what we're offering as an alternative will support that. And so we need to strengthen the world's ability to ask as much of the Chinese as they would of anybody else, not to say no Chinese projects, but make them follow the rules and create mechanisms and incentive structures that make it worth their while to do so.
What's your stance, Didi?
Yeah, gosh, it's just such a different philosophy, isn't it? This whole idea of this sort of state-driven, go out there, BRI kind of power projection, export of overcapacity, sort of, it's such a different approach that it is going to be a very different response. I think, as Scott already indicated, the idea of a lot of different kinds of private capital coming together. Interesting that Japan is so active here. Japan, of course, is a forever neighbor of China. It's a lifer, if you like. So what happens in China becomes more and more of concern to Japan. And I, in fact, once met a South Korean diplomat who said to me, it's interesting watching you guys here in Europe talk about China, because here in South Korea, you see the storm approaching, but in South Korea, we're already in the eye of the storm. And that's exactly what he said. And, Japan, of course, is the same. And Japan has recently been saying very interesting things also about Taiwan, talking about how actually the defense of Taiwan is part of the, Japan's own sense of national security, or its need for security from China. So that's super interesting. But I think, we are at a kind of a pivotal moment here, and I'm not saying it's going to happen fast, but I don't think that Europe's going to be able to sort of sit around and just say, look, I'm just going to balance out the US and China, because this project, this BRI thing, well, its end destination is in Western Europe. It's in places like Rotterdam. It's about building a Eurasian landmass. I know there are different, it goes through Africa, India, there are the southern routes, there's even an Arctic route. But if we're talking about the Eurasian landmass, it ends in the West, in the western parts of Western Europe. So it's something that I think that, well, again, Europe's going to have to decide, where it stands. And I really think that it's not going to get away with just sort of being this sort of ducking the problem and not making decisions on choices. And they will be, I would hope that they will be based on values rather than, you know, the next quarterly profit or the fortunes of an extraordinarily large German industrial conglomerate. Much as I have, you know, sympathy for their plight, there's a sense that some of these big German companies have recklessly invested, in fact, in China. And of course, you know, we forget in Europe that in fact, China never wanted to give its car industry to Japan. It chose Germany. It didn't want it to give it to Japan. If you think about, Japan had a pretty good car industry and was far closer to China. I mean, it would have saved a lot of money this way or the other, but China didn't do that because Japan's the eternal enemy. It gave it to Germany, and it did kind of give it to Germany. You know, it sought out, sure, there's great technology here, etc., but Japanese cars aren't that bad either, let's be honest. I realize it's a controversial thing to say in Germany, but you know, so these plans, I just don't know that these plans are really what work in our societies, you know, and it's a tricky one, but I think that Europe's going to need to think much more carefully about how deep it's getting into this Eurasian landmass thing, because we are definitely also seeing China and Russia pulling together in some very crucial ways, and that's creating just this massive block. Yeah.
While looking at the clock, we have nearly 10 minutes left. I would, if you like, incorporate one last issue. I think it's quite interesting. It's a large issue, but I recently purchased the book 2034 by Elliot Ackerman and James Stavridis. It's a book of a potential Third World War erupting in the South China Sea. So it was hard to get that book, but I can recommend it. My question regards and from an American perspective, because in German media, this issue or the overall European involvement in the South China Sea, which is of vital interest for the US and for China as well. So, Scott, how do you see, is there even a role for Europe in the South China Sea? The German Navy dispatched one Navy vessel, for example, a couple of weeks ago to the region. France and the UK, they are supporting the US in their freedom of navigation operations in the region. So do you see that Europe can play any part in this, can support the US in the region, which is a hotspot of geopolitical tension?
I think it's a great question. And the purpose of those books aren't to tell us what our destiny is. It's to tell us how we can avoid that destiny and perhaps find others and smile at the same time or cry. Europe has an interest in East Asia's or the free and open Indo-Pacific's security situation, because if there is a war, it is going to embroil the US. It could embroil Europe possibly as well. It will certainly have major disruption to the global economy. It will mean we will not be focusing on dealing with climate change or public health issues or migration issues or many of the other issues that are that we need to, and they'll set us back. We're set back a lot because of the current global pandemic that we're going through on multiple fronts. So I think for Europe, its interests are several. First of all, it wants the Chinese and others to follow the rules of the road, whether that road is on land, in the air, in the water. And we have the Law of the Sea Convention and others which suggest that in this part of the world, in the South China Sea, there's significant amounts of international waterways for commercial shipping and travel that need to be maintained. And that applies there, but it applies everywhere as a basic principle. It's also in Europe's interest that the specific disputes that China has with its neighbors, whether it's in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea or with India, are resolved peaceably without war. Again, huge consequences, and the Chinese and Indians both have nuclear weapons, and so That is really important. Thirdly, crisis management. There's a possibility that we will have crises. And currently, there are hotlines, but these hotlines are essentially unplugged and unused. And we need to make sure that the Chinese can, and the Americans at a minimum, can expect that if they pick up those phones, they will have someone on the other end and they will actually be able to make decisions. So we've had previous crises where we called and they didn't answer, or they called and said, we'll get back to you. And it took a long time. And so for rule of law reasons, resolving disputes peacefully, and for crisis management, the EU should care significantly and play a role in East Asian security issues. And I think we saw the beginnings of that in the discussion with President Biden's trip last month. And I expect we'll see greater attention. We're not going to be, I don't think the US is going to be demanding the EU pay more for defense the way the Trump administration said we have this transactional relationship and just pay up. They'll be saying, here, you now have greater global responsibilities. Our partnership is global in nature. And that will be the test. It's actually probably asking more of Europe than just simply sending a check or sliding a credit card. This is more significant, but it's about that longer term partnership as opposed to paying your protector, which is how the Trump administration envisioned things.
Would you like to respond, Betty?
I think that Taiwan here is something where Europe can do a lot. It's lagging behind the US in offering greater recognition to Taiwan. There is room for doing so, including in Europe. And Germany, again, I'm afraid, is one of the worst offenders. In fact, as I understand it, Germany maintains the longest do not meet list of any European country, of any EU country, when it comes to Taiwan officials. So, for example, 5 top Taiwan officials from the president, and then, various Supreme Court legislature officials can't be met in public by European officials. But there's 7 in Germany, for example. These were the last figures last time I checked. In Germany, there are 7 Taiwan officials who can't be met by German officials. So Germany maintains a pretty forbidding attitude in many ways toward Taiwan. And it's not the only country in Europe to do so, of course. But I think that there's real room there to mount deterrence of a non-military nature by Europe, by every country in Europe, including the EU, by significantly deepening, widening, and opening up relations to Taiwan. And I mean, it's a little bit hard to understand in these sort of days of international sort of pandemic, etc., why we're not doing more to draw Taiwan in when, of course, they knew from the get-go what was happening in China, and they knew that this virus was contagious, and they tried to warn the world community, and the world community ignored it because Taiwan's not in the WHO, because China opposes Taiwan to be in the WHO. I mean, frankly, it's just a whole barrel of wrong. If we'd listened to Taiwan in the first place, we might be in a very different situation, because we actually trust people in Taiwan to know what they're talking about. Whereas unfortunately, that trust does not exist with China because of its massive censorship and information management system, where you really have no idea what is true and what is not true. And most of it, is politically, it's a Leninist state, so it's politically manipulated anyway. So again, I mean, just after the pandemic, it seems to me there's even more reason to reach out to Taiwan. And this is something I think that Europe can do very much, not just reach out to Taiwan, but also other forms of spreading its risks, not being quite so keen about, investing just in China, looking elsewhere, Southeast Asia, looking to other places. It's a form of balancing, hedging your own bets. And I think rather than getting, necessarily militarily involved in South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, this may be a far more interesting way for Europe to support itself and to support the transatlantic alliance with this issue of China.
Okay, we have 1 minute left for our discussion, so I would pose a final hypothetical question to you with regard to the upcoming German federal elections. So if you could advise the German government, what is the most important, the most crucial issue that needs to be tackled, to be addressed? What should it be within the context of this discussion? So I would like to have a short reply, if possible.
Why don't I go first? Because I know that I'm most likely to be wrong, and indeed you can correct me. my knowledge of German politics is far less, and she's obviously displayed herself to be a fantastic China expert in this hour and a half as well, and I've learned a ton, and I've really enjoyed the conversation, Andreas, with you and with everybody attending, and I look forward to further conversations. And I'm really now going to be paying a lot more attention to the Chancellor's visit this Friday and over the weekend here in Washington. And she's got very hot weather awaiting her arrival, I think. But hopefully she'll have more collegial conversation with President Biden and his team. I think really the fundamental issue is, can we, as a broadly conceived West with certain kinds of values, figure out how to strengthen the foundations of our own system, our own societies, and engage and interact with China, which represents a different alternative system from a position of strength. How do we maximize those strengths that we have and reduce the vulnerabilities that we have? I know that those vulnerabilities, as we've discussed the last 90 minutes, are significant, and the Chinese are very good at exploiting them or exaggerating them and us believing them. Yet, I still think that we should come from a position of strength and optimism, and that if we are cool and careful and calm, we can avoid the worst outcomes, which is a death spiral into an open conflict, or a bifurcated world, which is much less prosperous and which is much less able to deal with climate change and many other global public issues. But it is a huge challenge to recognize where our values converge, even where there are differences, where we can see those are friendly differences. And also because we have genuine commercial competitive interests, like market economies do. But we have some fundamental things that keep us going, that if we can recognize them, we can actually grow our economic pie at the same time. So that is the big challenge, to figure out how we can get all of these things to work in harmony with each other, rather than seeing them as trade-offs.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and be brief. There's a lot of things that could be said. I'm not convinced that this trip to the US is going to yield great benefits. I'm not sure what Germany can really offer the US at this point. Angela Merkel's on her way out. We may get her successor, Armin Laschet, in which case we're in for more of the same, apparently. We'll see how that works out. I think, I mean, this is a little bit perhaps parochial in the sense that I wrote a book about technology transfer to China from the world. I co-wrote it. But I really think at this point that Germany is outside of the United States. I think Germany is the biggest center of high technology that is flowing to China and Europe, but Germany within Europe. And I think that it's really important that Germany moves to stop that outflow, because a lot of it is being procured by, at best, gray zone means. There's knowledge transfer, there's technology transfer of some of it is legitimate, some of it is not legitimate, and some of it is, i.e. it's illegal, and some of it is gray zone. And I think that, I think it's all very well being an open society, but I think if you're, just playing a different game from the other person that you're, in the court with, you're playing tennis, they're playing squash, or, you're playing ping pong, they're playing badminton. Well, it's a mess, right? And we'll see the consequences. China's now challenging us for kind of world supremacy off the back of incredible economic growth, which was in large part fueled by this technology transfer. And, you know, this is a really strange situation to be in. And I think that would be my one wish, would actually that Germany would domestically begin to take far more responsibility and look far more carefully at all the technology that's flowing to China from here, because I think that that would go a long way toward raising the cost for China of this kind of, you know, international behavior that is challenging many of us now. To know that there's a price to pay, something like that.
Yes. Thank you very much for your input. I really enjoyed the discussion today. Thank you very much, Scott Kennedy and Didi Kirsten-Tedler, for your expertise, for your insight you've given last 90 minutes. I would also like the German-American Center, the James and Burns Institute in Stuttgart, for being our cooperation partner for this talk. Thank you very much for this. And I give to Sonia for short last remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. Of course, on behalf of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom, I would very much like to express a big, big thank you to all of you, Scott Kennedy, Didi Kirsten-Tedler, and you, Andreas, for moderating this event. And I also want to thank the German-American Center in Stuttgart for co-organizing. And of course, I appreciate very much you as listeners contributing through your questions and listening to this web talk in front of your home screens. I hope you enjoyed this talk as much as I did, and we would very much hope to see you participate in one of our upcoming events. With this said, I would end the web talk for today. Have a good evening. Thank you and goodbye.
Everyone.
Thanks so much.